All right, I'm here with Dan Butler, professor of political science at Washington University in St. Louis. And Dan was a contributor to the Primary Election Study 2024, which is a really interesting article and data set where Verasight collected the data studying primary voters. So we're going to talk a little bit with Dan about what's so interesting and important about this study. So with that, why don't you go ahead and kick us off, Dan, and talk a little bit about the Primary Election Study 2024.
Yeah, we were really excited about doing this project and really excited about doing it with Verasight. There's a lot of questions that we care about in terms of who votes in primaries, how are they voting when they're voting in primaries, and some of these really can't be answered with existing studies or, quite frankly, with existing approaches. So a very simple one. We have reasons to care about how people vote during a primary election. And there's reasons, first off, to study this in the primaries and not just rely on what happens in the general. So if you think about the general election, we have a lot to say about that, and both a lot and actually not that much, which is how is someone going to vote in the general election? Well, basically, they're going to say, how do I feel about the parties? And maybe they'll say, how do I feel about the economy? And that does the vast majority of the work. But think about voting in a primary, right? Like you're going to decide between two Democrats or two Republicans based on how you feel about the party,
right,
about Trump. No, right? And same with the economy. So these factors, which we know really predict what happened in the general, can't really tell us how people are thinking about in the primary. It's also the case that you could say, let's solve this problem by not running a special survey in the primary election. Let's just do our normal survey in November, October, and we'll just ask retrospectively. We'll say, hey, 6 months ago, how did you vote? People misremember, and even if they remembering whether they voted or not, let alone who they voted for. And they also post-election, depending on the election, the outcome, they may think differently about how they voted or why they voted a given way. And so those questions just aren't reliable in a way that we would feel comfortable with. And so those existing approaches just aren't going to work. And so we really thought it was important to study how people are deciding how to turn out, how to vote at the time of the primary elections themselves. And so we were really excited about this project.
That's very cool. And so it sounds like that specific approach is like underutilized or understudied, right? How to maybe studying primary voters in general and then specifically studying them at the time of the primary election. I assume there are some practical reasons that it's been understudied. So maybe you can talk about some of the challenges with reaching that population at the right time and what you did to try to solve those in the primary election study and why that's something that you think can be built upon in the future.
Yeah, I mean, one of the exciting developments in our discipline has been the proliferation of the ability to survey more people. And that's great, and it's awesome. And really, for the most part, we've developed techniques and infrastructures that are aimed at saying, well, I want to get a representative sample of the whole population, which for the record is great. And we answer so many important questions with that. From there, voter turnout's pretty high. So more than half people vote in the November election. And so even if you're just saying, I want a general population sample, you can still get a pretty good population of voters and really study why are they turning out in the general or how are they voting and how are they making decisions. But the number of people who vote in primaries is just really small. So if you rely on that techniques to say, well, we're going to a general population sample and some of them will be primary voters, the answer, that's correct. Some of them will be. But it's going to be a much smaller percentage and it's going to be so it becomes cost prohibitive potentially, right? Which is, oh, well, if we really want 1,000 primary voters, but we're going to have to survey some very large numbers, thousands of people to get that 1,000 respondents, that just adds the cost. So one of the things that Verasight did for us, and we partnered with them on, was saying, hey, we want in these states that we're studying, we want representative of the entire population, but we want to make sure we oversample primary voters and have like a representative set of primary voters. One of the things that's really cool is Verasight, they just worked with us on the project as we needed. And they said, okay, well, one of the things that we can do is we'll sample off of the voter file. Now, that may seem like a small thing, but that allows us to get people who actually are going to be primary voters at a much higher rate. Right. And we talked to some other very good firms, and we were trying to do this in a couple different states. And we said, okay, we want to do it we ended up doing it in 3 states, kind of as almost like a trial run. Like, could we do this? What would it look like? We chose California, Michigan, and Nevada. And California is so big that they were like, yeah, we can get you a set of voters in that state. Primary voters, a good sample. But Michigan, which is not particularly small, that was going to be tough. And Nevada, forget it. That was just never going to happen because they had a set panel, which again, high quality. It's not that they're a bad company. I would be happy to work with them again in the future, but they just couldn't do it. Right? That was just not even an option because their approach was a very specific type. And Verasight was very innovative and worked with us on getting a population that we would not have been able to get otherwise.
Very cool. Well, thanks for the kind words, Dan. Glad we were able to help out and make this study happen. I was just curious too, having read the article, you mentioned the states you chose, California, Michigan, and Nevada. Why did you actually choose those 3 states in particular?
Yeah. Well, partly we were going to treat this like a trial run. Say, okay, can we do this? And so we actually want to do it in a state that was smaller. Like we intentionally want to do in a state as small as Nevada. Could we, in fact? And the answer is yes, right? Which was like, oh, if we can do this in Nevada, then we're pretty sure we can do this in most states. We also were picking Nevada in part because among small states, because they had a ballot initiative where they were potentially going to add a different type of primary system. The voters rejected that ballot initiative, but had they voted on it, this would have been the pre-data, and then we would have been able to come back to the state and say, okay, well, we have some pre-data from that state. What does the post-data look like? That didn't happen, but still a great state to study. Had an interesting race on the Republican side to challenge a Democratic incumbent. And so the other states, we really wanted California in part because they have a different type of primary system. So one of the things that we care about as researchers is thinking, do the rules matter? So can we see differences across states based on the rules? And so we wanted to make sure we had a state like Washington or California where they have a primary system that's different. So in California, all the candidates run on the same ballot in the primary. And the idea is the top 2 vote getters, regardless of their party, go on to a general election runoff. So you can have, and not all the time, but occasionally we'll have 2 Democrats in the general or 2 Republicans in the general. And the dynamics there are potentially different. And we want to study that, right? And see how are people voting when they have this option that they don't have in every state.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, sounds like some really interesting dynamics on a state-to-state basis. I guess most of us, like if we haven't voted in a bunch of different states in our lives, don't realize like how different the primary systems can be depending on the state. And yeah, the US is fascinating also just in how different a state like Nevada is from California in terms of the population and the political composition and stuff like that. So that makes a ton of sense. So it sounds like the study is hopefully like foundational for future study of primary elections. I know you also asked a number of interesting questions in the survey. So would love to talk about that a little bit. Like what are some interesting things that you learned from the survey itself?
Yeah, I mean, we're super excited about the long-term applications of both this specific survey, but also just the idea that we can do surveys like this, right? And opening up beyond us. I'm going to stick with a topic we kind of talked about, which was the California top 2 primary, the all-candidate primary system. And, one of the things we looked at is we wanted to see how often does someone cross over. So they say that they normally identify with one party, but with this all-candidate ballot, they have the potential to vote for someone in the other party. And we kind of want to see, does this happen? If it does happen, what's their motivation, right? And so there's some concerns that people might cross over and sabotage the other party. So they're going to vote for the candidate who they think is so bad that they can't possibly win the general, and then their party will do better, right?
Right.
And or they might say, my party's not likely to do well in this particular race, so I'm going to cross over and I'm going to pick among my preferred candidates on the other side and have a voice in that way. And I personally take this as a positive, which is we do see people crossing over and voting. And it's exactly the kind of people we would think are doing this if they're doing it with that kind of intention of, I want a better representative of me in the end, right? So we don't see that kind of sabotaging, people raiding the other party and trying to pick someone who they think is, or at least it's not consistent with that story as much. We see several interesting findings coming out. We see the minority party in California, which is the Republicans, they're more likely to do it, which makes sense, right? Which is like if your party is not as likely to win the general, then you maybe have more interest in caring about, well, who's going to win on the other side, right? So I have at least have a say at that stage. And so we see them being more likely, and we see among Republicans, it's moderates, right? So, which again, kind of would fit with what you would expect. We also see, actually, there's an interesting study a couple of years ago, and one of the things they found is there's this big concept, affective polarization out there. The idea that people really hate the other party. So it's not simply that I disagree with them, but like, I don't want to see them, like I don't want to be friends with them. And this prior study, it shows that it looked at what happens within one's own party and how much they strategically vote. And the people who really hate the other party, they find are more likely to strategically vote. So by strategically, the idea here is maybe I really like this candidate ideologically, but this candidate has a better chance of winning. So And so the idea here is people who hate the other party so much, they're like, okay, yes, I like this person better, but I really dislike their party, so I really want to win. So I'm more likely to strategically vote. And so it almost has like a bright spot to this negative trend, right? Like, oh, people, we're able to replicate that finding in our own study, but we also go further and show, well, that same dynamic in other contexts is not necessarily promoting kind of more moderates or more what we might think of as good outcomes. So it's also the case that people who had that same affective polarization, they dislike the other party, they are less likely to cross over. So in the California context, where everyone has this chance, and in fact, you're more likely to affect who wins by going in the major party, who's most likely to be the dominant party candidate, they're less likely to participate in that. And so, right, because they can't even bring themselves to cross over and have their voice heard because they dislike that group so much. So again, these are some of the fun things we saw, and we were able to look at this because we're not asking them 6 months later, hey, remember there was that election in March? Like, what did you do? Right? So we're asking, hey, there's an election next week. Who are you going to vote for? And so it was really exciting to see that.
Very cool. So the polarized folks are more likely to strategically vote within their own party, but less likely to be strategic in the sense of switching over to affecting the other party or having the voice in the other party. Okay, interesting. Fascinating. Cool. Well, thanks for walking us through some of the interesting things you found in the study. Maybe as we kind of close towards wrapping up here, I would love to know what you would like to see going forward. Like, what do you think people should do with the results of this study? What are some additional follow-on research that you think would be really helpful?
Yeah, I'm going to make a plug for two things. I really want us to think more about why people vote in primaries versus at general elections. We have way lower participation rates in primaries, which in some ways is shocking because the fact is in a lot of our general elections, the outcome is all but determined, especially thinking about like members of Congress, right? Those races, once they get to the general, we have a pretty good sense of who's going to win district by district. But we don't have that same sense of who's necessarily going to win in primaries. These are races that matter. I think they're more impactful on predicting who actually serves the individuals. But we have lower participation, right? And I think there's lots of reasons there. I mean, one thing that we asked about, and I'm hoping people may be able to use our question, either the existing data we have or build on it. But we just kind of asked, like, do you think of voting in the primary as a civic duty? And I think we train people to think about voting in the general as a civic duty. And my own desire is that we could get more and more people to think of voting in a primary, right? Like picking a party and saying, well, I'm going to vote with this party. And if they're out of step with me, I'm going to try to bring them back into step with me, right? And I think we should view that as a civic duty. And so I would love to see people like really embrace that question and take it in interesting ways.
Got it. Cool. So much more to do with primaries in terms of understanding them, but also getting more people to participate. Maybe it'll be easier to get a sample in the future.
That's right.
If we're successful. Awesome. Well, Dan, it's been great spending some time with you. Really excited about this study going out there into the world. Would encourage anyone listening to this to go ahead and read the article, which we'll link to. And hopefully I'll see you again sometime soon, Dan.
Thanks, Tyler.